All right, good morning. Well, you are watching my video lecture on issues of overpopulation. So, at the end of last class period, you guys were looking at population pyramids, and you are welcome to take a minute to get that packet out. I think we covered in our class most of what you need to cover for population pyramids. So, really, for the most part, this first part of the video lecture is just kind of review because we did it at the end of class. And then we have a couple of new ideas that I want to share with you towards the end of this. All right, so just recall from last time that population pyramids are a kind of a visual or graphic representing the structure of a population. And demographers, remember, demographers are people who study population, they can find out lots of information about certain countries based on what the population pyramid looks like. We can typically tell if there's gender selection going on. We can tell if they're having a quick doubling time. We can probably even tell what part of the world that the country is in based on their population pyramid. And so, just as a quick reminder, remember that the way that we read these, the males are on the left side, the females are on the right, the young people are at the bottom, and the old people are at the top, and then the kind of the working population is in the middle. Now, um, at some point, I don't know if it'll be today, it might be at the end of the period today or next class, you guys will be watching a video on population pyramids, and they kind of break it down the way that I just did. They may break it down into pre-productive reproductive years for like girls 0 to 14, and then reproductive years, which are going to be like 15 up to about 64, and then post reproductive years, which are somewhere after 40. So they might break it down a little bit differently than me. But for my class, the way I want you guys to know it is dependents are going to be anything probably 0 to 16, and then the worker bees are going to be 16 to about 65, and then anything 65 and over is going to be elderly, and they're going to be dependent as well because they're retired and they typically don't work. All right, last thing on there, we talked about age groups. There's a fancy schmancy term for age group. It's called a cohort. So just know if you see that term cohort, it just means an age group interval. And so you could see like the first age group interval would be 0 through 4. All right, another term that we're using here that I don't know if I formally introduced, but you need to make sure you get down, and that's the term dependency ratio. So the dependency ratio basically looks at how much strain that you're putting on your worker bees, and so we kind of, officially call it a measure of the economic impact of the younger cohort or the older cohort on the most productive cohort, which is the worker bees. So just to kind of put this in English, you you want to take a look at how outnumbered your worker bees are. And so if generally speaking, if you look at a population breakdown and there are like 5 kids for every one worker bee, well, that's too much. Really, you want no more than about 2 to 1. So if you have 2 kids for every one worker bee, that's typically a country can handle that. But when we see a stage 2 country in Africa or someplace like that, where they're literally like 4, 5, 6 kids compared to every adult, that makes it really difficult. Likewise, when we look at a country in Europe or Japan or something like that, where you've got 3, 4, 5 old people compared to the worker bees, that gets to be too much impact on those worker bees. Because you got to think that when the kids are young, the older people are taking care of them. When you're talking about like Japan, now those worker bees are having to provide health care and assistance and things like that for the elderly. So that's called dependency ratio. How big is your dependency ratio? All right. So again, from last time, you go ahead and you can kind of take a look at your note packet on population pyramids if you want to take a look and just see. We should know now that a true pyramid looking one will look kind of like this, like Nigeria. As you can see down at the bottom, you have extending growth out each cohort. So we would assume that the next age group, so as the 0s to 4, as they age and become 5 to 9, the next group of 0 to 4 will be out past 16. Or if you look at that population of millions down at the bottom, we would imagine that probably that next group will be past 16. So that's rapid growth. And so this is a classic stage 2 country. You can see that they don't have a ton of people on the top. And, if we really broke this down from a percentage standpoint, you're talking that probably 30 to 40% of all Nigerians are under the age of 15. That's a lot of dependence. And so they would have a high dependency ratio of young people. Okay, then this would be Bangladesh. So if you don't know where Bangladesh is just east of India. And they are, they're a classic stage 3 country. So if you take a look, you can see that they have moderate growth. They're kind of slowing down a little bit. So if we took a look at their natural increase rate, it's probably pushing like 0.7 or 0.6 or 0.5, but it's not quite yet slow, but it is slowing down. And so instead of the bottom looking more like a pyramid, this would be more kind of, moderate growth. Whereas the United States has almost hit what we call ZPG. And so if you kind of take a look at the slope of the pyramid, once we stopped growing, then you can see how it's basically straight up and down. So this would be a stage 4 country. You've got slow, stable growth. Really, your population's not going to double for a few hundred years. And so that gives governments time to deal with doubling time issues. And then at the other end of the spectrum, here's what a stage 5 country looks like. You've got at the bottom of the pyramid, their pyramid keeps going in and in and in. And so if you look at like their 40 to 44 cohort, that was like a big baby boom generation, them and the 65 to 69 population group. And now, ever since then, each cohort is smaller and smaller and smaller. And so this creates a problem for Japan as well. Their government's going to have to figure out what to do. And so we'll talk about what governments do when the age groups start to do different things like this. But this would be a stage 5 and declining population. All right, the original thinker or geographer that even started discussing population growth was Thomas Malthus back in the 1700s. Now, you have to understand that before industrialization, population growth wasn't even an issue. And so really Malthus is kind of seen as the first geographer that even started speaking on issues of overpopulation. He lived in England during the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And remember that England was the first country to go through the Industrial Revolution. So nobody had seen anything like this before. And Malthus was very aware that as fast as the population was going, that if other countries besides his started going through this Industrial Revolution, which it looked very clearly like France and the Netherlands and Germany and some other countries were going to start going through this very soon, excuse me, that at some point, if we kept growing at that pace, that we would outgrow the Earth's capacity to supply food. And you have to understand, back in those days, there was no genetically modified organisms. There was no chemical fertilizers or John Deere combine, threshers or anything like that. And for the most part, you got food from, probably the 5 or 10 miles away from where you lived. And so, Malthus doesn't have the benefit of hindsight like we do today, knowing how we've manipulated and increased our food supply. But at the time, Malthus's predictions were very alarming to people. And they were pretty scared that if the population kept growing like this throughout the world, that, we were going to have wars over food and there was going to be massive starvation. And it could be kind of apocalyptic, all because the population was growing so fast and the food supply wasn't keeping up with that. So really his idea was about this thing called carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is kind of a threshold of how many people the earth can hold before you start having, shortages, before you start having, starvation and things like that. And so some people will argue, well, Malthus is correct because we have starving people on earth. But other people have argued, no, it's not that we don't have enough food. It's that food is not distributed evenly. Countries like the United States, people typically have way more food than they need. And, then countries in like sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have enough. If the food were all distributed evenly, then probably there would be enough food for everyone to eat. But when we talk about carrying capacity, this is what Malthus was talking about: the amount of the population the Earth's resources can hold or sustain before we have mass starvations and a worldwide conflict over resources like food. We've never actually hit that point, although whenever your country, we need to be aware that when your country is in stage two, that is when Malthus's theories look pretty good. Stage two and stage three, you have really exceeded your carrying capacity, and you do have an issue feeding your population. But for the most part, we should also know that Malthus's predictions turned out to be incorrect, especially once you get to like stage four and stage five of the DTM, of the demographic transition model, where your population levels out and then actually begins to decline, and then food really isn't that much of an issue. Okay. So going along with this idea of carrying capacity, if you exceed your carrying capacity, then you are what demographers call overpopulated, and your population is just too big for the available resources. Now, Malthus just talked about food, but when we look at other things, it's not just food. It could be healthcare, it could be drinking water, it could be housing, all those other things. That's really kind of the issues of a quick doubling time. So when we say was he correct, for the most part he is not correct, but he is kind of correct during stage 2 and 3. All right, so here's kind of what it looks like when you're in a stage 2 country. You can take a look at the top right hand corner. That's in, I believe, Jakarta, Indonesia, where they have a mountain of trash, and the poor people go through there and they try to find anything they can to either eat and or sell. And that's pretty gross and disgusting for us here in the first world or in more developed countries. But that's what people do to have to get by. So when we have a quick doubling time, remember a quick doubling time is anything probably under about 50 years. This is where Malthus's theory looks like it's a pretty good theory, but you're going to have a strain on all sorts of different resources. And so let's kind of talk about specifics. One of the things we see in an LDC is that people they have to, if they cook food, they have to have some sort of fuel to burn in. So typically that fuel is trees. They don't have gas pipelines and things like your family does, where they can just turn on the electricity or turn on the gas and cook their food. They typically have to cut down trees, which leads to deforestation in these LDCs. But whatever it is, they have a strain on the environment, the available resources, and that makes it pretty tough for their government to deal with. Housing, you can see a squatter. This is what's called a squatter settlement. So look at the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, and you can see these makeshift kind of shacks. And then you can also see what's kind of disgusting for us is where these people get their water. And so they're, a lot of times they're where they go to the bathroom is the same place that they're getting their water to drink or to cook. And so this is why societies that look like this historically have to deal with waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery and typhus and all these bad things that just basically shut down your body. Okay, if you have a quick doubling time and you're exceeding your carrying capacity and you're overpopulated, you may not have enough schools, and schools are very important in terms of if your kids get an education, they become more productive. When they're more productive, they have more skills. With more skills, that is good for the country, because then you get more engineers to create and more doctors to perform surgeries, and more scientists to discover new cures for diseases, or whatever the case is. But you want your people to be productive. If all they can do is push grocery carts, well, that's not very productive for your country. And the problem is when you have too many people, you may not have enough teachers for them. You may not have enough schools for them. And, then it's kind of a vicious cycle of poverty that your people are in until you can get them to the point where they're productive and educated. Healthcare, right? And so, you may not have enough doctors. You may not have enough hospitals. You may not have enough medicine to give people when they're sick. And so all of these, again, are issues of having exceeded your carrying capacity. All right, the next word is infrastructure. So if you take a look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can actually see a country that's fairly well developed, and it looks like this one's probably, in Europe or maybe even some parts of South America. It's obviously still a traffic jam, which might lead you to believe say that they have inadequate infrastructure, but it looks like they have, a pretty big highway there, 5 lanes each way. And so infrastructure are all the things that your country uses to try to make your country run smoothly. And so if you think about like power lines and fiber optic cables for internet and electric lines and gas lines and water lines. Those are all part of infrastructure. And when your population's growing too quickly, then you may not have enough of that infrastructure to help your country run smoothly. If you go back to the housing on the bottom left-hand corner, I'm assuming that they don't have running water pipes going in those shacks. I'm assuming that they don't have electricity. And I'm also assuming that they don't have any indoor plumbing. And so without that infrastructure, that's not a very healthy way to live. And so these people's life expectancy is going to be very short compared to yours as a result of not having good infrastructure. And then kind of going along with that, you can see in both those pictures in the top right-hand corner of the unsanitary landfill, and then in the bottom left-hand corner in the squatter settlement, yeah, you don't have very good sanitation. So all of these really are problems of exceeding your carrying capacity and reaching overpopulation and having a quick doubling time in terms of your population. It's just going to be too many people and not enough of the things you need to live. Okay. And so what do governments do? Well, governments historically have tried to manipulate their population growth. They've tried to figure out a way during stages 2 and 3 to artificially bring it down. And what I can tell you is there's never been any country that's been overly successful. What we know is that as your people urbanize and as you give women more education, as you give women more power over their body, that's really the best way to bring down your natural increase rate. But unfortunately, none of those things will take care of population growth immediately. And so, any stage 2 or stage 3 country that we go to today, we're going to find that they have issues of exceeding their carrying capacity. And so, governments have tried to bring down their natural increase rate the best they can. And any policy where they're trying to restrict or reduce population growth, that is called an antinatalist policy. Okay, so let's talk about a few of those that you need to write down. All right, one of them would be government-sponsored sterilization efforts. I know this isn't a pleasant thing to think about, but if mom and or dad go into the doctor's office and then the surgeon can basically disconnect the parts that they need to be connected inside of you to make a baby possible to be born. And so if you don't pay for this, then people may not be willing to do it. But if the government sponsors this, then maybe people will be more willing to go in and get those surgeries done. Okay, secondly, and you're going to see this in both antinatalist and pronatalist or just natalist, and that's propaganda. And so I want you guys to take a look at the pictures that I have on the screens here. Propaganda is just any information that a group, in this case, the government, puts out to kind of influence you to think a certain way. And so you can see these kind of ones that are that I have up here. So down at the bottom there, you can see how happy the Chinese family is by having one child. And that seems to be the ideal family, is 2 happy parents and 1 happy child. And then the one in the top, 1 and 2, and that's ideal. So you can actually see that this was a family planning sterilization propaganda poster that a government had. Okay, the best, and you need to put a star by this in your notes. The absolute best thing you can do to bring down your natural increase rate is to just treat your women better, to educate girls, to empower them so that they have power over their bodies. And some of that is really difficult because you have to change your culture. So if you guys remember in the People Paradox video, the family in India, the mother-in-law was just putting all sorts of pressure on her daughter-in-law to have another child, even though it was likely that if the daughter had another child, she would probably die. So really, your government has to really work to change the culture and to give females power over their own bodies, and to, once you urbanize, you won't need as many kids to be working on farms, and so that will kind of take care of itself a little bit that way. Okay, the other thing that you could do that I don't have on here, but you could write down, is the government could, issue out free birth control. So birth control pills, condoms, IUDs, like whatever kind of birth control. If a government really wants to bring it down, then they can just, through healthcare clinics and things like that, you can just go and get, some kind of, birth control. Okay, some famous examples that we've had of this. You guys are going to watch a video today on the one child policy. So once this video lecture is over, Mr. Lukenhaus will be taking you through the one child policy video. Now, China doesn't have this policy exactly anymore. It's really kind of, they backed off on it a little bit because it caused them all sorts of social problems, increased human trafficking, prostitution. They were abandoning girls in in parks and things like this. And so even though it did help bring down the natural increase rate to some degree, it caused all sorts of social problems. So, like I said, a lot of countries have tried some of these things. I don't know if any of them have worked well, other than increasing the education for women. India, they tried the sterilizations. They also did something called birth spacing. Now, I want you to write this down. So, birth spacing means that they encourage their people to wait a few years before they try to have their next kid. And this will reduce the amount of years that women can get pregnant. So, instead of just having, babies year after year after year after year after year, with birth spacing, you're saying, okay, well, have a baby and then wait like 3 or 4 years, and that will cut down the number of productive years a woman has, and hopefully less babies will be born. And then you can see that, in Nigeria, the government has started to pay for planning assistance, where they're distributing birth control, they're teaching birth spacing, they're paying for, I think, for sterilizations to some degree. And so that's helping a little bit. All right. So again, that's antinatalism. You guys will be watching the China one child policy video shortly. And then ending up today, we're going to talk about pronatalism. So this is an issue for countries on the other end of the spectrum. So this is going to be like some of your European countries, Northern European, Japan. Those are countries that they're in stage 5. They're declining. And so really the major issue that you guys should know about these stage 5 countries is that economically, each generation, they have less people to produce in their economy. And they're not worried about necessarily disappearing as a people, but it's really about output. Like, how successful is your country going to be with less and less people? And so those people either have to become super productive, or you need to somehow start to incentivize the people that are in their reproductive years, 15 through 40, 45. You have to encourage those people to have more kids. And that's really difficult, because when the average age of your population is above the age of like 35, people just aren't going to want to have more than maybe one, at most 2 kids. And that's below replacement fertility level. Remember, we talked about this in class a little bit. If you have mom and dad die, that's -2 in the world population. You need to have at least 2 kids to replace mom and dad that have died. So your replacement fertility is going to be basically 2. And a lot of these countries that are in stage 5, they're below replacement fertility level, which means their total fertility rate for the women is like 1 child, or 1.5 children. And that's just too low to replace the population. And so more people are dying off than are being born. Therefore, governments have turned to what's called natalism, or pronatalist policies. And these are any policies that are created to try to encourage citizens to have more kids. They could just flat out outlaw abortion and maybe even birth control, and that way it would kind of force the population back up. But probably the most successful things that they've done is to give some sort of financial incentive. Now, governments don't just like to give out money. Like, they're not going to say, okay, have a baby and we'll give you $25,000. They don't do it like that. What they will do, however, is they'll give you tax breaks, or they will give you free daycare, or maternity or paternity leave. So Let's write down those if we don't know what those are. Maternity leave is when mom gets to take off time and she still gets paid by her employer, or paternity leave is when dad does that. And so like in Norway at one point they were allowing mom to take off almost a year and they would still pay like 60% of her salary. And so that might be some sort of benefit from your employer, to take some time off and to produce more children. Now that being said, again, if your average age of your people is above the age of 35, you can give whatever benefits you want, but they may not want to take them. But some examples that we have had besides maternity and paternity leave would be like Russia went so far as to offer prizes for patriotic mothers. And so if you had a certain amount of kids, your household got a refrigerator. A certain amount of kids, you got a microwave. Or there was even a certain prize where if you had, I think it was like 6 to 8 children, you would get a government paid for SUV. And I don't know how good the SUV was, but this is kind of that propaganda. So if you take a look at that picture, where you have this mom, and I'll tell you that no mother with this many children looks that rested and happy. If she had that many kids, she'd probably look exhausted and tired. But that's propaganda right there. And then look at who everybody's looking at. They're looking at the mother, the strong figure there. And so be a patriotic mother and have more children. That's great propaganda. Italy, they gave out tax breaks. The Catholic, Church, for example, is very strong in Italy. They encourage their believers not to use birth control. They say it's a sin against God, and so they kind of put, I guess, fear a little bit into their believers not to use birth control. So these are all ways that governments can try to, encourage their population to have more kids. But I'll tell you that probably the best one on this entire screen, besides maternity and paternity leave, is to encourage immigration. Some countries are really facing this one. Japan, so far, they have resisted immigration. The only immigrants that Japan will let in are people that have like high skills, so like surgeons or engineers or somebody that would be very beneficial for their population. Other than that, the Japanese just don't allow any kind of immigrants in. Whereas I think I told you in class, Norway, they've come to the realization that their own people, no matter how much they incentivize it, are not going to have more kids. And so they've worked out a deal with Ethiopia to send up guest workers, and those Ethiopians come up and they live in Norway. And so you can do that as well. I mean, typically speaking, if these stage 4 and 5 countries invite immigrants to come in, the immigrants are coming from countries with excess population that are looking to get rid of some of these people. And so, they're coming from stage 2 and 3 countries. And typically, a lot of these people are uneducated. They don't have a lot of skills. And so they're not competing with the native population for jobs. They're usually taking the jobs of that the native population just doesn't want. And that's typically what we see, in Mexico. When Mexico sends up immigrants, they're not going to steal your parents' jobs. They're going to take jobs that typically your parents don't want to do. All right, so that ends our discussion on overpopulation. And like I said, you're about to watch a video about China's attempt to control their population growth through the one-child policy. So I hope you enjoy that. Take care, and we'll see you in class.